I mean, every song on this album, we only have a 2-minute counter at the beginning of the show. The songs are all longer than 2 minutes. It's always so hard for me to turn off the song. That was Le Mancha by Eitan Katz. We're getting near the end of his album, Live in Jerusalem. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. I didn't think we were going to be able to do it today. I mean, Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram and Messenger, which is all the same company, we're out all day long. I was already telling people we weren't going to be able to have our show today, but it seems to have come back online. People are watching, so thank God the show goes on. We do our learning for today. Who is with us as we do some beautiful learning on a Monday night? Stephen in New Hampshire, Tom in PA, Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella says shalom, James says shalom, Rebecca in LA, John in Maine, Beth in the USA, PK in Colorado, Caroline. Yesterday was my twin sister and my birthday, and we are together 1 century old. Mazel tov, mazel tov, Yom Holedet Sameach. May you both enjoy this world and all the opportunities that it provides to 120. And we say amen. John is learning in Las Vegas. Nancy in North Carolina. Carolyn in Raleigh. Yehuda in South Carolina. Ryan in Jacksonville. Paul in the Great Northwest. Guy in Ohio. Renee in Indiana. David in Indiana. Lucy in Minnesota. PK could not even get Facebook to come on this morning. I mean, it was like apparently the biggest social media outage and the longest outage of a major company ever. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? Not our problem unless it interferes with our class. And then, terrible problem, but thank God it's not breaking in on us today. Over on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas, Seraphim in Sacramento, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Our learning today is sponsored by Steve Spira for the yahrzeit of his father, Shimon ben Shlomo Zalman. Today is his yahrzeit, and Steve's dad shares a yahrzeit with two incredible people, Shimon Hatzadik, who is mentioned several times in Pirkei Avos, just an amazing one, and the head of the, he was the first of the sages sort of listed in order once we go past the time of the prophets, the judges, etc. And Yitzhak Abarvanel, who was a figure in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, tried to prevent the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, was unable to do that, went up to Portugal, became an advisor to the king of Portugal, and then eventually Portugal kicked the Jews out. Again, the Abravanel tribe. And so he was an important figure kind of on the world stage, but he was also an incredible Torah commentator, a great, great sage. So Steve, your dad has a very special yahrzeit, and we pray that our learning today can accrue to Shimon ben Shlomo Zalman's merit in the world of souls and take him even higher than he already is. And we know he's in a very high plane indeed up there. And Steve, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And we say amen. Okay, a quick Torah thought before we get to our daf. This is from a book I've quoted a few times, Avraham Twersky's book, The Enemy Within, about managing the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination within all of us. And he says that, and Rabbi Twersky was also a doctor, psychiatrist, and a great therapist, dealing especially with addiction issues. And that's certainly one of the ways that the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, can undermine a person's potential in this world, is by getting us addicted to things. Says the Hasidic master, Rabbi Aaron of Karlin, the Karliner Rebbe, that although the Torah does not explicitly state that being sad is sinful, of course the Torah wouldn't say that, but there is nothing that can bring about as much sin as feeling dejected. Sadness is a very painful feeling, and people do many unwise things in an attempt to relieve this pain. Now, sadness is obviously going to come our way many times in life. I mean, it's that kind of a world. Many sad things happen to all of us. That's natural, that's normal. There's nothing, sinful about feeling sad. The problem comes when we allow that sadness to take over, when we feel that it will never end. And worse, when we allow, a natural response to things that are happening in the world to start to be identified with who we really are. And not only that, but to color our judgment in such a way that we start to feel ashamed of ourselves or dejected about our possibilities. We stop believing in ourselves and believing in what we have the potential to do. Now, we don't want to confuse this with humility. The Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Fathers, say that a person should be exceedingly humble. We should always pursue true humility. However, being humble does not mean that we should consider ourselves to be inadequate, incompetent, or worthless. We're not. We're souls. We're parts of God sent into this world on a mission. God believed in us enough to send us into this world. So sometimes we go through a rough patch and we feel like we just can't get anything right. And then we start to, kind of like swallow some bad results and say, well, I've had some tough breaks. It must be because I'm worthless, because I'm incompetent, because I just can't do anything right. Says Rabbi Twersky, we should at all times be aware of our great worth. As the Talmud says, beloved are the children of Israel, for they are described as the children of God. Now here he's addressing a Jewish audience, but clearly all people are the children of God. Indeed, it is precisely this feeling of great worthiness and pride that should deter us from doing anything that is beneath our dignity. Like you got to absorb this, especially when you're feeling down, when you're feeling really down, you feel like you can't break out of it. You got to remember that you are a child of God. You are a part of God. You are a soul that God sent into this world on a mission. He wouldn't have done that if he didn't believe in you. So you are truly a very special being, right? Now, yes, you have that in common with every other human being, and that we meet a lot of human beings that we deem, really unworthy in our eyes, even worthless. That's a mistake. People make mistakes. People sin. People even commit outright evil. And that's a terrible, warping of that soul's mission in this world. And that's tragic and sad, and evil needs to be punished. But what we all have in common is we had great potential when we got here, right? When we got here. And one of the traps that we fall into that will limit us and keep us from fulfilling our potential is wallowing in sadness beyond what is reasonable for a given event, wallowing in self-pity beyond what is reasonable. The Chazon Ish said, many people err in understanding humility, thinking that it means to consider themselves dull and incompetent. True humility is to know one's capacities and value, but not to demand to be honored for these. The awareness of one's talents should stimulate a person to greater achievement both in whatever they're doing in their lives and in Torah learning and in spirituality, right? So that is the teaching, and that's something that we want to remember when we get into a period of being down. We've had some tough breaks, and we start to just sink in and say, I'm never going to get it right. I'm never going to learn anything. I'm never going to better my lot. I'm never going to accomplish what I set out to accomplish. No, you can, you will. It's in you. Just acknowledge who you really are, what you can do. If things are terribly challenging right now, then be patient, but continue to believe in yourself the way that God believes in you, and that's why God sent you into this world. Okay, where are we holding? This is Tractate Beitzah, the 8th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 4, discussing today the 8th Mishna and opening our discussion of the 9th Mishna here in chapter 4. We're generally talking about the laws of festivals, and we've been drilling down and getting more specific about, yes, on a festival, unlike Shabbos, we're allowed to engage in the work of food preparation, but we can't do everything that is related to food preparation because there's a lot of tasks that should have been done before the festival began. And once the festival starts, even though it's related to food preparation, that relationship can be a little bit too attenuated or present other difficulties. So an example we've already talked about is, in ancient times, right, they were cooking over a wood fire, in an oven, or literally over an open fire, or in a stove, which was kind of a clay arrangement, an earthenware arrangement where they could put a pot over the fire, etc. So can you chop wood on the festival? Not in the weekday manner. Can you chop wood off a tree? Not at all. That's considered harvesting. Right? If you must cut up wood, you should have done that before the festival. If you must do it during the festival, so you can't use an axe. You can only use a cleaver. So you're doing it in a really unusual way, not suggestive of regular weekday work. Now we're going to talk about where, for example, and that's why I titled today's show, can you break in a new wok to use on a festival? What's the problem? A wok, as I understand it, I'm no expert in Chinese cooking, but a wok, as I understand, or Japanese cooking, I apologize if I'm getting that all wrong. But a wok, as I understand it, is not ready to be used until it's seasoned. Now, how do you season a wok? I saw a video about this like some weeks ago. That's why it was in my mind. And I remember that part of seasoning a wok is treating it with heat and other liquids. That's not going to be possible to do on a festival, even though you can cook on a festival, because now you would be finishing the vessel, right? It's like you're creating the vessel that was not ready for use until you did that. And so it seems like you wouldn't be able to use the wok. However, if you had done this, at least that part of the seasoning, so the wok is really ready, and then for a wok to be totally ready to use, I think you have to cook onions in it, right? Now you're cooking onions, and especially if you're going to eat those onions, that's permitted, right? And if in the process it sort of puts the finishing touch on the wok, maybe that's okay. I'm not sure. If you really had this question about a wok, you should consult a rabbi, but I'm just sort of explaining what the issues are involved. So let's get into it. We start at the very bottom of page 33 on the B side, and our Mishna, the 8th Mishna of chapter 4, states that one may not whiten tiles by heating them in order to roast food on them, right? So in these old earthenware clay ovens that they used, you might want to put food not on the bottom of the oven, the clay oven that has all kinds of ash and soot, kind of embedded in it. But normally we would use some kind of oven tray, like a Pyrex oven tray. Okay, they didn't have that. So what would they cook the meat on? These tiles, right? So they had special tiles for that. The problem with these tiles is they needed to be finished, and so maybe you had these white tiles, meaning that they're new tiles, they've never been used. Can you use these new white tiles for this purpose of cooking on the festival? It's problematic because they need to be fired at least once in the oven to see if they'll break or not, to test them. And if they break, so then it ruined your food. You did labor that was unnecessary and therefore prohibited, right? You should have tested the tiles, fired them up and tested them before the festival began. That's why our Mishna said one may not whiten tiles by heating them in order to roast food on them. And the Gemara asks, what does one thereby do? Since his intention is to prepare food, how does this differ from any other manner of roasting? And Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, here we are dealing with new tiles, and it is prohibited because it is necessary to test them to ensure that they do not burst when heated. If they are heated for the first time on a festival, he will thereby be testing them, which is the last step in producing these tiles to get them ready for cooking in one of these, old school ovens from ancient times. And this is a prohibited labor. And some say because it is necessary to harden them by overheating them the first time to make them fit for use, which is considered preparing a vessel for use, and it is prohibited on a festival. So they're not calling it striking the final blow, but they are saying that that vessel was not ready to use until it went through that final overheating. So you can't do that final overheating during the festival because that vessel was not prepared for use before the festival began. Therefore, it was muktzah. It was set aside from use, not prepared for use. You only finished it so that it would be prepared for use during the festival. Too late, you touched a muktzah item which you should not have handled. Now we're on 34. On the A side, we skip a little. It is taught in a baraisa, it is possible for several people to perform a single act of cooking on Shabbos, and all of them will be liable. So this is one of these Talmudic teaching aids. Right? The idea is nobody can cook on Shabbos. Why would we even be talking about cooking on Shabbos? Cooking is permitted on a festival, not on Shabbos. No cooking allowed on Shabbos. You can allow things to be heated that were already cooked and remain heated so long as you don't even touch what's ever heating them, the settings, the dials, no extra heat, no extra insulation added on Shabbos. That's why we can have hot food on Shabbos. That's what cholent is. Right, cholent is mostly cooked before Shabbos begins, and then it sort of keeps simmering all through Shabbos, and then you can have a nice hot, kind of stew on for Shabbos lunch, but you didn't cook at all during Shabbos. You just ate the food on Shabbos. But now what they're talking about is a kind of hypothetical example where a whole bunch of people were involved in cooking and doing a prohibited labor. They're committing a sin by cooking on Shabbos. And the question is, do all the people that participate in this kind of group effort, group sin, do they all become liable to bring a sin offering? That would only happen when the temple is standing. But we're studying the principle to understand who is actually committing the sin and who is not, and why. So it is taught in a baraisa. It is possible that several people perform a single act of cooking on Shabbos and all of them are liable to bring a sin offering. How so? One brings the fire, and one brings the wood, and one places the pot on the stove, and one brings the water for the pot, and one puts spices into the food, and one stirs the pot, and they are all liable for cooking. They're all liable for violating the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos. Now the Gemara questions this. But wasn't it taught in a different baraisa? Let me turn this off. Sorry. But wasn't it taught in a different baraisa? Where am I? Sorry, got distracted. But wasn't it taught in a different baraisa that the last one is liable and all the rest of them are exempt? So you would think, well, wait a minute. Didn't they all participate in the cooking? Why is one of them going to be liable and the rest exempt? And the Gemara responds, La Kasha, this is not difficult. This case where all are liable is referring to a situation in which he brought fire at the outset. And therefore, each of them performed part of the act of cooking. But the second case, where only the last one is liable, is referring to a situation in which he brought the fire at the end. In that case, none of the earlier people performed any aspect of cooking at all, as the labor of cooking begins only from when the fire is brought. Now, we should remember, When do you become liable to bring a sin offering, right? Again, only when the temple is standing do we have sin offerings offered. But for what action does one become liable to bring a sin offering? It's for an unintentional violation of a Torah prohibition. If you do it intentionally, knowing that it's a Torah prohibition, you can't, atone for that by bringing the sin offering. If you violate a rabbinic prohibition, you get lashes. You don't become liable to bring a sin offering. So all these people that participated putting a pot on the stove, putting water in the pot, putting food in the pot, putting seasoning in the pot, none of them were cooking. They were preparing to cook. That is prohibited on Shabbos, but they haven't actually cooked, so they're not liable to bring a sin offering. This might happen, for example, if they didn't know it was Shabbos, right? So that's why it would happen unintentionally. But all of these people, they didn't actually participate in cooking because there was no fire. The one who comes and turns the fire on, he has now, first of all, he's kindled fire on Shabbos, so that's another sin offering. But now he has started the process of cooking, right? And so only he would be liable. On the other hand, if he turned on the fire first and then somebody put a pot on top and added water and added food and added seasonings and stirred it, then they would all be liable to bring the sin offering. And the Gemara asks, granted, all of them performed an action that constitutes a prohibited labor, and they are therefore partners in a prohibited act and a desecration of Shabbos. But the one who places the pot on the stove, what prohibited labor has he performed? And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, here we are dealing with a new pot, and due to whitening tiles, they applied the same prohibition to it. Right? So that's why this particular teaching about all these people involved and who's liable to bring a sin offering or not, why it was brought up at this time. So they're saying even if the fire was started first, the one who put a pot on a fire, did he engage in cooking? There was no food, no liquid, no nothing in the pot. Why would he be guilty of anything if all he did is he put a pot over a flame? And that's why Shimon ben Lakish explains, well, in that case, it was a new pot. And the kinds of pots that we're talking about needed to be fired the first time for the pot to really be ready to cook, right? So this new pot before it, is fired for a while isn't ready for cooking. And if he did that on Shabbos, that is also a prohibited labor. It's not cooking. It's not cooking. It's something else, right? And so it's the same as the prohibition due to whitening the tiles. It's really striking the final blow, right? It's taking that vessel and completing it. Next subject. The sages taught in the Tosefta, new ovens and stoves are similar to all vessels that may be carried in a courtyard on a festival, as one can place items on them. Okay, so new ovens and stoves, you might think they're muktzah because while they're new, they might require finishing before you can cook on them. Since they're new and they haven't done that, it should be muktzah. You can't touch it at all on the festival. But if it's already within your courtyard, they're saying you can move it simply by using it now as a vessel to carry something else that is permitted to move. You could put some food on it and now just move it from one place to another, and it's really just a carrying utensil for the food that you put on top of it. However, one may not anoint them with oil, nor rub them with a rag, nor cool them with cold liquids to prevent them from overheating, as all these actions are considered preparing the vessel for use, which may not be done on a festival. And if one did so in order to bake in the oven on the festival, this is permitted. So that's surprising. New ovens and stoves. It is permitted to kindle new ovens and stoves for the first time on a festival, but one may not anoint them with oil or rub them with a rag in order to prepare them, nor may one pour cold water over them in order to harden them. And it is necessary to cool them, and it is necessary to cool them with cold water so that they can be used for baking. And if it is necessary to cool them with cold water so that they can be used for baking, it is permitted to do so. So again, the distinction they're making, if you have a new oven and it's ready for use, okay, you can use it, you can cook on it, doesn't matter that it's new. But if it's not ready for use because it requires one more step in order to be ready, then it wasn't prepared before the festival. You're not going to be able to prepare it for use during the festival. And the sages taught in a Tosefta, during a festival, one may scald the head and the feet of a slaughtered animal with hot water in order to remove the hairs from them, and one may singe them in fire for this purpose, but one may not smear them with clay, nor earth, nor lime, in order to remove the hairs, because this involves great effort, and it appears as though he is processing the skin, too similar to a weekday labor, the labor of tanning, right, preparing the skin. And one may not shear those hairs with scissors, as it appears as though he is performing the labor of shearing in an attempt to obtain the hairs for themselves. So as we've seen over and over again, you can prepare food for the festival, but in your food preparation, don't get involved in something that looks like the weekday work of something that's beyond food preparation, like preparing the hide to be used to be turned into leather, or shearing the animal's wool, for example, if you were cooking a sheep, as if you were going to use that, the sheared wool to, make clothing out of. That you can't do on the festival. Similarly, one may not trim the top of the leaves connected to the vegetable with special shears, but one may prepare kundas and akaviot, which are bitter vegetables that can be eaten only after extensive cooking, even though this involves great effort. And one may kindle fire and bake in a large baker's oven, and one may heat water in an antiki, which is a kind of large urn, but one may not bake in a new baker's oven lest it break. If the oven cracks when heated because it was not properly made, one will have performed unnecessary work on a festival. And so right there, when you're talking about an urn, that's an example of, in an observant Jewish home, there's an urn in the kitchen, right? So it's something that before Shabbos or a festival began, you boiled water in it. When you add water to it, it boils it. It keeps it just below boiling temperature. And then you could make tea or instant coffee even on Shabbos, right? By transferring that water to a vessel, and then from that vessel to another vessel where you're going to make your tea or instant coffee. That's not considered cooking, right? Making tea from the second vessel, the cliche is that's permitted. Likewise with instant coffee. What you can't do is brew coffee on Shabbos, nor drip through like slow drip coffee, like a pour over. On a festival, you could do that, right? So you could do that. So on Shabbos, if you ran out of water in that urn, like a bunch of people wanted to have tea from that urn, could you add water to it? No, you could not, because then you would be heating up that water for the first time during Shabbos, prohibited. Can you add water to the urn on a festival? Seems like, yeah. Why not? You can cook on a festival, so you can heat up water. You can't kindle a fire from nothing, as we saw yesterday. You can't light a match. You can only, light your stove or light the cooking fire from an existing fire. But you can heat up food. You can cook food. So why couldn't you boil water? So you can add water to the urn on a festival. You can't do that on Shabbos. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8. Now we open Mishnah number 9. And Rabbi Eliezer further stated the following leniency. A person may stand over objects that are in storage, like his storeroom, such as produce that he has for some reason previously set aside from use. And on Erev Shabbat, during the sabbatical year, so Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos has begun, Friday afternoon, during the sabbatical year, right? During the sabbatical year, we don't have an obligation to tithe our produce, right? So you live in the land of Israel, you have to tithe all the produce, as we've talked about, especially when the temple is standing, right? First 2% goes to the priest, the next 10% goes to the Levites, and then the next 10% more or less goes in most years to you, but you can only spend it in Jerusalem when you go up there for one of the pilgrimage festivals, or in some of the years it goes to the poor. And until you separate those tithes from your produce, you can't eat that produce. And we've learned you can't tithe your produce. You can't separate the tithes from your produce during Shabbos or during a festival. The act of separating tithes and rendering something ready for eating, because before it's tithed you can't, after it's tithed you can eat it, but that act of tithing and rendering it ready for eating is something that you can't do during the festival. Why? Because that food before the festival began was untithed, and therefore it was muktzah. Set aside, you can't use it. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying, okay, you have some produce, it's in storage, so you weren't planning on eating it. You were planning on selling it, right? You're a farmer, let's say, and you have a bunch of produce in storage, and you weren't planning on eating it during this Shabbos. But then you realize you don't have quite enough food in the house for Shabbos, so you go into your storeroom and you stand over some of this stuff, even though it's untithed, right? And say, okay, I'm going to eat this stuff tomorrow. Why can you do that? He said it's a sabbatical year. Otherwise, you have to separate the tithe. You can't just designate the food for eating during Shabbos. But there's no tithing during the Shemitah year, right? During the sabbatical year. This is one of those years, by the way. Okay, so a person may stand over these objects in storage on Erev Shabbos, right, Friday afternoon, during the sabbatical year, during which no tithes are separated, which means one may take fruit on the following day without the need for any corrective measure. And on this day, Friday afternoon, he may say, from here, from these fruits, I will eat tomorrow. And the rabbis say he may not eat unless he marks the pile of fruit the day before and explicitly says, from here to there, I will take. He can't just say, I'm going to take food from my storeroom. He can't even stand in the room and say, I'm going to take food from here in the storeroom. The rabbis say you have to designate the food clearly that you are saying you're going to eat on Shabbos, as opposed to the rest of the produce in that shed, which you're holding for buying and selling, not for eating. So you're not designated for use on this Shabbos. Okay, why is this relevant to what we're talking about with respect to festivals? The Gemara will explain. We learned in a Mishna there in another location, children who hid figs for themselves in a field on Shabbos Eve, right, Friday afternoon, in order to eat them on Shabbos, and they forgot, and they didn't separate tithes. Not only are they prohibited from eating them on Shabbos, for eating on Shabbos is always considered a fixed meal that obligates the produce in tithes, but even after the conclusion of Shabbos, they may not eat until they have separated tithes. So to understand this, imagine, you're on a farm, right, and you've harvested, and there's a bunch of produce that is lying around in piles, untithed, okay? So you can't bring it in to eat for your meals. Can you, while you're harvesting and while you're adding food to these piles of produce, can you eat some of that food? Like, for example, you own an orchard. While you're walking through your orchard harvesting apples, while you're working picking apples, your workers themselves, can they eat apples? Especially with your permission. So forget about stealing. That's another law. That they're definitely allowed to do that. But just casual eating is what we're talking about, as opposed to eating that food as part of a meal. Casual eating, yes, you can. You can in a casual manner eat untithed produce. What you can't do is take untithed produce and make it part of a meal, right? A meal that you're going to say Birkat Hamazon afterwards. And all eating that happens on Shabbos, even if it doesn't include bread, which is what normally makes something into a meal, but all eating that happens during Shabbos, which helps us to celebrate Shabbos, anything that we eat on Shabbos is part of rejoicing in Shabbos. So anything that you eat acquires the character of a meal, of a designated meal. Doesn't mean that you're going to have to bench afterwards and say the full blessings afterwards when you have a meal that includes bread, but you should not be eating untithed produce on Shabbos at all, right? So that's what this is about. So these kids who just took some figs from the field, and then they hid them somewhere because they were planning to eat them on Shabbos, but they didn't tithe them, right? So now that food is not available for eating on Shabbos, and it cannot be tithed on Shabbos, so you have to wait till after Shabbos. And the fact that you set it aside for eating on Shabbos, even though it was prohibited to eat it on Shabbos since it was untithed, but the fact that you set it aside for eating on Shabbos now means that particular food can't be eaten until it's tithed, right? And that has to be done after Shabbos ends. One who transfers figs into his courtyard in order to make them into dry figs, right? Fresh figs, and you scatter them in your courtyard so they're going to dry in the sun. They're going to become dried figs the way grapes become raisins. And his children and the members of his household may, in the meantime, partake of them in a casual manner, as they are exempt from tithes, right? They're going to become dried figs, so they don't need to be tithed until the production of them is complete, until they become a big stack of dried figs. You don't have to tithe them, and you can eat them in the meantime in a casual way. But if you tried to make more of a formal meal out of them, or save them, set them aside to be eaten during Shabbos, then they need to be tithed before you can eat them, and you can't do that tithing on Shabbos or on a festival. Based on these two sources, Rava inquired of Rav Nachman, okay, so with regard to Shabbos, what is the law in terms of whether it establishes an obligation to tithe food that was muktzah, right, that was not prepared for use on that Shabbos? Specifically, in the case of an item whose labor has not been completed, like these figs that were spread out in the sun to become dried figs, so their labor's not completed. Does the fact that the food is muktzah, so now it's set aside from eating, you weren't planning to eat it, right? You could eat it casually, but the fact that you set it aside for drying indicates that in your mind, that food is unfinished and you're not going to eat it. Therefore, with regard to Shabbos, it's muktzah. It shouldn't be touched or handled at all, let alone eating during Shabbos. So does the fact that the food is muktzah on Shabbos give it the status of completely prepared food or not? The fact that it's now muktzah with respect to Shabbos, should that actually say, I'm actually confused about this. Why does the fact that it's muktzah on Shabbos give it the status of a completely prepared food or not? We'll come back. Do we say that since it is written, and call Shabbos a delight, Isaiah 58:13, so this implies that any food that one eats on Shabbos is considered a delight and not a casual meal, and therefore Shabbat establishes an obligation to tithe as if the food were fully completed and fit to be eaten as a fixed meal, even for an item that has not had its, in the same way that, in the same way as food that is completed and set aside for a fixed meal. But does that now apply to even an item that has not had its labor completed? Or perhaps Shabbos establishes an obligation to tithe an item whose labor is completed, but regarding an item whose labor is not completed, it does not establish an obligation to tithe. Rav Nachman said to Rava, Shabbos establishes the obligation for tithes, both with regard to an item whose work is completed and for things whose work is not completed, right? Like the grapes, you can eat grapes, but if a particular bunch of grapes, you set them aside to become raisins, right? Now their labor is not completed and you're not going to be tithing them until they have become raisins. But now you want to eat them on Shabbos. Are they muktzah and off limits? Okay, but then, why would you tithe them since you can't touch them anyway? Where they're getting to is they were muktzah and you shouldn't have touched them. But you did anyway, right? And you knew that they were untithed, so you tithed them on Shabbos, which is prohibited, but you did it, the guy did it anyway. So now that he touched this, uncompleted food, and he tithed it, right, so that he could eat it on Shabbos, is the food actually going to be permitted? He violated a couple rules in touching it and tithing it, but now that all of that is done, are we going to penalize him and say he can't eat the food, or are we going to permit the food? So Rav Nachman said to Rava, Shabbos establishes the obligation for tithes, both with regard to an item whose work is completed and things whose work is not completed. Rava said to Rav Nachman and challenged, but say that the law of Shabbos should be similar to the law of the courtyard. Just as bringing that food into a courtyard establishes that the food placed inside the courtyard is like a fixed meal with regard to tithes, only when the work on the item is completed, so too Shabbos should establish only an item should establish as that it's necessary to tithe it only if the work is completed. The grapes have become raisins, and then it would be liable for tithing. And Rav Nachman said to Rava, I did not say this based on my own logic, which can be countered by logic of your own. Rather, we have it as an ordered teaching that Shabbos establishes both things whose work is completed and things whose work is not completed. What does it mean that Shabbos establishes? Is that if you decided to eat it on Shabbos, even though you were eating it casually, not as part of a meal, so that tithing shouldn't kick in, the fact that you ate it on Shabbos now takes casual eating and elevates it to the status of a meal, which would require tithing. Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, said, we too, and I'm almost done, so get your questions in. Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, said, we too have learned in the Mishna. And Rabbi Eliezer further stated that a person may stand over objects. Now we're back to our Mishnah. A person may stand over objects in the storage area on Shabbos Eve, on Friday afternoon, during a sabbatical year when tithing is not necessary, and say, I will eat from here and here. Now the reason is that it is fruit of the sabbatical year, with regard to which one is not obligated to separate tithes. However, if it occurred in any other year, the 6 other years of the 7-year cycle, so too you will say that it is prohibited to eat them without separating tithes. What is the reason for this? Is it not because Shabbos establishes them with regard to tithes, and consequently they may not be eaten until tithes have been separated? The Gemara refutes this. This is no proof, for there it is different. Since he said, from here I will eat tomorrow, he has immediately established for himself a meal with them by stating his intention to eat the food as it is, even though it has not reached its completion. These are grapes, not yet raisins, even though they were set aside to become raisins. And the Gemara asks, if so, why does the Mishnah mention particularly Shabbos? Even if one said so on a weekday, the same should apply. Since he has set them aside for his meal, they are considered finished, and so therefore they're liable to tithes. And the Gemara answers, this comes to teach us the following. One should not conclude that untithed produce is inherently muktzah and cannot be touched or handled during Shabbos or a festival, because one may not separate the tithes and eat it. You can't assume that it is muktzah because on Shabbos or the festival, you can't separate the tithes. Rather, it is considered prepared with regard to Shabbos in that if one transgressed the word of the sages and corrected it by separating the tithes, it is considered corrected. So where did the law end up on this? How does Shabbos establish the status of a fruit? Even on Shabbos, only fruit whose work has been completed is considered established with regard to tithes, that it must be tithed. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan later in the Gemara, as opposed to the opinion of Rav Nachman here. So the law is actually not going to be where Rav Nachman came out in this argument, right? So the fact that you plan to eat it on Shabbos, if they were grapes that were set aside to become raisins, then even though you plan to eat it on Shabbos, it doesn't need to be tithed because it's going to be considered casual eating even on Shabbos, since that food isn't, what it's going to be, which is the raisins. In terms of tithing produce on Shabbos, one who unwittingly separated teruma, the first tithe for the priest, and other tithes on Shabbos may eat the produce that he has tithed. Right? He violated a rabbinic decree when he separated the tithes on Shabbos. But having done it, now the food is tithed and he can eat it. However, if he did so, if he did it by mistake. If he did so in willful disregard of the law, he may not eat the produce until after Shabbos. So you can't do it accidentally on purpose. If you know you're doing it, that food is going to be prohibited for the rest of Shabbos. In any case, the produce does remain tithed, even if you violated the rabbinic decree and separated the tithe on Shabbos. Okay, that was not so easy. Hopefully you hung in there with me to understand that argument. Questions and comments on Beitzah 34. Sharon Frant Brooks. I don't know about preparing a hide, but I know about pin feathers on a chicken, always evident on kosher chicken. Can one pluck the feathers? Yes, absolutely. Because there, what you're doing is making sure that this chicken that you're going to eat on the festival, doesn't have like feathers that are going to be annoying, like these little pins that you're going to eat them and it's going to be gross. So that you can do. What they're saying is don't get into a situation where, you've got a big crowd coming, you're plucking feathers of lots of chickens, and you start doing it in a kind of assembly line fashion, which resembles how, at the kosher market, they're plucking, hundreds of chickens, and it looks like the work of a weekday, right? So if you have that many people coming and that big a dinner you're preparing, you probably should have done a bunch of work before the festival started, so that on the festival itself, you're just doing the cooking. You didn't do it, more people came, okay, you're going to have to make that shinui and get the feathers out in a way that doesn't resemble an industrial process. Bill, clarification. Can you only not add water to the urn if it was empty? Or is topping up the urn, adding more water to the already hot water inside, also out? Also out, right? You can't add water to the urn on Shabbos. You can on the festival, you can't on Shabbos. Because any water that you add to the urn, like topping it up, as you're saying, that water that you added was room temperature and then went into the urn and then it got heated up. So now you're heating water on Shabbos, not permitted. Sharon, I thought you could add water into an urn if it was only a small percentage of the total amount. It depends on how much you add. It can't cool down the total very much and heat it up to the prior temperature. I believe you can add in small amounts if the water remains warm enough to use throughout the process. Okay, so maybe there's you're going to be depending on nullification, right? That the fact, I seem to remember something like this, that you're adding in these small amounts that are essentially nullified by what's already in there. It's not going to affect what's in there, but it's tricky. It's tricky, right? You're taking water that was room temperature and it's going to be heated. So I'm not a rabbi. I'm just talking offhand here. But it seems to me that it's going to be very tricky and something to be avoided to add water to the urn on Shabbos. Right? Very tricky, very dangerous. Tom, without tithes, what did the Leviim and Kohanim eat during the Shemitah year? Great question. All right. So first of all, it's not like that's all that they did, right? It's not like they're much more Leviim than could be serving in the temple, right? There are many more priests than are serving the temple too, right? There's only a small percentage of the priests serving the temple at any one time. So the rest of the year, what are they doing? The Leviim and the Kohanim. I mean, they don't own land, but they're living in cities and they're, businessmen and doctors and lawyers and accountants and, merchants, right? Or the owners of breweries and all kinds of other businesses that they just didn't, as a tribe, they were not allotted land as an inheritance. They got the cities. What was the tithe, what sustained them? I think it helped sustain them for sure. But they were business people who could have a business and buy their food, etc. It's not that priests are only permitted to eat food that's consecrated for their use, right? They would have to eat food that's in a state of purity. And when they're eating teruma, right? Which is tithe foods that have been set aside for the priest and maintained in a pure state, and only priests could eat that food. Yes, it had to be pure or it couldn't be eaten even by the priest. But it's not to say that priests could only eat teruma. It's just that, the rest of the people had to give them teruma. Okay. That's what I've got for us today with God's help. Facebook will still be around tomorrow, as well as YouTube, and we'll be learning together at our regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.